I'm very appreciative recently to have spent time with Reverend Christopher Wickland in Fareham in Hampshire. He shared something about the work he's doing in helping British people to value themselves in the light of today's apparent rapid internationalization, Islamization, and so forth of what we could call traditional UK ways of life. While I very much appreciate what Chris is sharing, it also struck me that I would like to make some suggestions um, to add to the case that he's making. Now, I make those suggestions as someone who has lived and worked overseas for the last 38 years, so is more familiar with the way the UK appears from outside of the West, particularly from Africa, more specifically East Africa, and on that basis to make further suggestions to, I hope, help Chris and people like Chris to make the case that they are making. So 6 points. Firstly, there's something wrong for Christian civilization when one hardly cares about a people at all until they step onto your own soil. Then suddenly they seem to become human, and numerous types of aid are available to them. Surely this is a kind of hypocrisy. The UK has a global-wide responsibility to love people. It's not required to love only those who manage to come onto UK soil. If it does the latter, and it's a prosperous place, then of course people keep coming as they possibly can until there's no more resources available to distribute to people who do come to UK. Love is about God. God is love. The Bible tells us in the first letter of John, chapter 4, verse 8. So what here is required is what I want to call a postmodern missionary movement. A means not only of handing out goodies, but of enabling people in other parts of the world to also put in place structures that can enable the kind of thriving for which the UK is historically known and for which the West is historically known. This should not then be a spreading of Western money and languages. Now I say that particularly because when Western money and languages, which are abundant compared to those of other parts of the world, are part of the message one takes outside of the West, then that tends to close the mouth of the people with whom one is engaging as they're looking forward to the money and benefiting from the powerful language. So what I'm proposing is we need a kind of a postmodern mission, which is a mission engagement with people who uses their languages and their resources, and in the process of doing that, endeavors to impart, to share benefits that UK itself has drawn on to become who it is. That particularly is the gospel of Jesus Christ and the love of Christ. Secondly, making one's country financially very lucrative destination to people from all over the world to emigrate to, even illegal, is in some respects, I suggest, immoral. It can unsettle everyone else's domestic policies. It can force all countries around the world to listen to the West, not because they want to, because it may be splitting their families and disrupting their domestic policies. But it can make it impossible for people to sensibly lead their own nations. Now, language, I think, is a big issue here. Almost all of Africa thrives on European languages. In Anglophone Africa, which is a major chunk of sub-Saharan Africa, almost all children spend years and years of the prime of their youth focusing on the learning of English. Now, so what? Well, native English, in other words, British English use presupposes contexts and knowledge that many African children do not possess and do not experience. This means that when they learn English that comes from England for the prime years of their life, they're losing out on the potential to learn things that could be relevant to their own context, and they're preparing themselves for a life in which they articulate things so that they do not at depth grasp. This, I suggest, proves to be a major handicap to the thriving of countries outside of the West. So that, I suggest, it is immoral to put one's own country into a position in which it entices citizens from around the world to come, which forces governments around the world to orient their own policies linguistically in favor of learning the language of that particular realm. I mean, another way in which this challenges, threatens, undermines majority of world people would be the peculiar sexualization that's in the UK at the moment. And I think this is widely known because of the dependence of much of Africa on the English language that is of British origins. When Britain decides to change thousands of years of policy and promote trans policies, for example, liberal sexuality in a way that's never before been imagined, this puts other countries under pressure to follow suit, whether they like it or not, whether it makes sense or not, whether their people appreciate it or not. Now, that is an example of what I think is immoral behavior on the side of certain Western countries. If they want to, for themselves, on the basis of their own democracy, distort their people's sexuality, that's one thing. But to use their status as what you could call a world power to force others, therefore, to follow suit, to me is particularly immoral. Thirdly, the process of making foreigners who come to one's country enormously rich, relatively speaking, can support what may be unhelpful policies in other parts of the world. One example, the role of English in Africa. Millions and millions of African children are forced to spend the prime of their lives, many years of full-time study, learning English. Such swamping by British English can make it impossible for people to think clearly about themselves in ways that make local sense. The West supports and perpetuates this kind of swamping policy by often very generously rewarding people for their English knowledge. Now, I've really discussed this already above. And point 4, the linguistic understanding underlying today's foreign policy by Western nations largely ignores pragmatic, that is, contextual foundations of language comprehension. As a result, competency is, on a global level, measured in a way that encourages incompetence. For example, people can be considered legally to be equally qualified for a certain job or position with no account of their history and culture. Now, this is a fundamental error that I think continues to be made in how English is assessed. Assessment of English is often considered to be the requirement in order to freely enter, say, the job market in the UK. And similarly, when someone is assessing who may be best qualified for a position in the UK, they will often consider their competence in English as foundational to that. And in some cases, taking other factors into account can even be illegal. So, for example, if you have two people who are academically equally qualified for a position and you choose someone of one ethnicity in preference to another, then that can be illegal. But what this does not take into account is pragmatics, how people use language contextually, aspects of people's lives that, even if they have fluent English under their belt, can reduce their competency in a workplace. So what I suggest is that English acquisition should be evaluated not only on the basis of someone's capability at fluent articulation or even comprehension, but also on all aspects of their life that in various ways could affect their performance. Most gregarious of all, perhaps, and I'm sure something that Chris also is aware of, Western ideological systems render decision makers blind and deaf to vast swathes of the realities underlying human social existence. In other words, by way of example, while secular liberalism continues to be upheld as a theology of contemporary life, impacts of Christianity on the history of the West, and by contrast, impacts arising from not having had a Christian history on other parts of the world, are ignored. In other words, that is to say that the contemporary West runs on a system of taboos. There are things that you are required to believe, and there are things that you are not permitted to state, even should they appear to you to be very true indeed. Now, for those familiar with the functioning of a Western country, those taboos are known qualities. So we in the UK know we can't say that, and we shouldn't say that. And despite the fact that this is true, it's not to be mentioned. But what of those other people who borrow and use our languages and try to imitate the thriving the UK has achieved without a close knowledge of what is not said because it is taboo? They take, in other words, what is publicly said and assume that to be sufficient as a basis for enabling their own peoples to thrive. Now, artificial intelligence, of course, aids this because artificial intelligence does not read what people neither write nor say. It only takes on board the wisdom that's made publicly and, let's say, formally accessible on the internet, what people write and put into the public arena. So it omits all of the taboo areas of the functioning of a country like the UK, which means that people in other parts of the world who aspire to imitate end up missing out on a lot of key knowledge. Now, perhaps every system of governance functions on the basis of certain taboos, but certainly contemporary liberalism does. It cannot cope, cannot deal with cultural diversity. So it requires communication on the assumption, which I think is clearly a wrong assumption, that liberalism is the way and everything else must and will bow to it. Number 6, the thriving of many countries around the world is extremely dependent on guidance coming from the UK and elsewhere in the West. The dependence that results may not be entirely healthy, but I believe should be dealt with intelligently. The UK and the West in general should, I believe, tackle this issue with global well-being in mind. For example, because Muslim countries do not work in such charitable ways, the UK's duty to the rest of the world includes deterring interference from Islam in its governing systems. So a country like the UK is drawn on, whether Africa draws heavily on the UK in its own governance. The African people themselves are holistic thinkers. They struggle to distinguish the physical from the spiritual, for example. That results in limitations in terms of the contemporary West in their own capabilities at governing their own people. They tend to a certain extent, to focus on funerals more than efficiency, for example. One impact of this is that they become very dependent on those who do have this dualism. It's not only Africa. I mean, the Arab states similarly draw, I understand, a great deal on Western populations, European and American populations, in order to develop and perpetuate their own thriving economies. Now, this has resulted in an enormous dependence of the rest of the world on the UK and its fellow Western European peoples. That dependence needs to be translated into responsibility. And I suggest that because of the dependence, UK has a responsibility to ensure that it will continue to be dependable to support those other realms that cannot thrive without it. This requires a maintenance of UK's freedom to communicate and operate globally, which, frankly, Islam would like to undercut. It's based on a Christian principle of love for all people and not an Islamic principle. So I'd ask you pray with me that activist thinkers like Chris be enabled to perceive ways more broadly than that at the moment of having effective and truly Christ-like impact on today's issues as they address today's issues and being faced by the UK and beyond.